We're talking today with Don Ryman of Buchanan, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Don, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Well, I was born at Brady Lake, Ohio, April 1st, 1928. My father at that time was going to Kent State University, and he was to get a life certificate as a teacher in Ohio. So they had rented this cottage at Brady Lake. Well, we moved. My father had a degree in mechanical engineering from Carnegie Tech, but he liked to teach school.
Okay.
Well, he changed jobs all the time. We moved 11 times until finally, we were able to buy a home in East Canton, Ohio, and we landed there. Well, August 9th, 1939. Just a few weeks later, World War II started, and it wasn't too long after that we had Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
And I lived through all those things.
All right. Let's just going to back up a little bit and fill some of this in. So, did your father have teaching jobs all this time?
Well, he didn't because of the Depression. But he did have teaching jobs. He taught manual training and other stuff at Louisville High School.
Mm-hmm.
But the Depression came along, and one of the school board members said, "Well, I'm a carpenter. I can do manual training." So my father lost his job.
Oh boy.
And my father, during the 30s, was in and out of employment. Mm-hmm. And it was a pretty rough time for us. Well, when World War II started, then the demand for engineers increased, and so he was able to have a job.
Right.
During World War II.
Right. Now you were kind of young at the time, but do you remember how you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Oh yes. Well, we had some friends from the First Christian Church in Canton, and they came out to our house after church, and they said, "Oh, there's been this attack at Dutch Harbor." Oh, we looked on the map. That's in Alaska.
Yeah.
They got it wrong. Well, then later we found it was Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. Well, Dutch Harbor got attacked too.
Yeah, yes. And I didn't know Pearl Harbor any better than I knew Dutch Harbor, tell the truth. But then the war started, and I was thinking, well, I was 13 years old, well, I wasn't that brave a guy. I thought, well, maybe this will all be over by the time I'm old enough to go into the service. And that's, with Hiroshima, that's what happened.
All right. Now, during the war years, how did the war kind of affect daily life? I mean, did you notice rationing or things like that?
Well, we didn't have gasoline. We couldn't drive our car very much. They rationed shoes and food and everything. My mother had problems getting food for the table. And I'd only get maybe one new pair of shoes a year. We knew that. Well, there were these boys I knew in high school who were a little older, who got in the service, and some of them died in the service. And that made quite an impression upon me. And I was pretty mad at the Germans. And when people use the term collaborate, that irritates me. A collaborator is somebody who cooperates with the enemy, and I never use that, and I don't like it. There are all other kinds of synonyms you use for collaboration. So that's just one of the things I got out of the war. Well, the war kept going on, and I was in high school, and it just happened I had skipped a grade, so all my classmates were a year older. And in 1945, they turned 18, and they were going into the service. Well, for one reason or another, most of them joined the Navy. I did have one classmate who was involved he was a couple of years older, and they picked him up in December of 1944, and he got into some of the last combat in France and Germany. So there I was. Well, I was 17 years old. I was going to turn 18, April 1st, 1945. So what should I do? Well, my parents, they didn't like war very well. They were pacifists, but their parents had been involved in the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley. And I guess both sides foraged and took their food and things like that. They didn't have much for war, but their attitude was, okay, when the draft board comes to get you, you will go. In the meantime, though, I figured I'd get a year of college in.
Right.
So I started at Ohio State University in June of 1945.
Okay. Now, how were you able to afford college at that point?
Well, my father was employed. I worked in this. I did get a job in the summer in the factory in Canton, Union Metal, and I saved that money. My mother cleaned houses, and my father worked, and so we managed to scrape by, although it was a near thing.
Yeah.
But it was only $15 a month, $15 a quarter, tuition of $45 a month, Roman. So I was able to scrape by.
Yeah. You had more state support for universities in those days, a little bit cheaper.
Well, I think maybe so. Well, then I got there, and these fellows from Cleveland said, well, you know, if you took 15 hours, 20 hours a quarter, you could graduate earlier. And you don't want to go to Ohio State University Law School. That's at the bottom of the Big Ten. You want to go to one of the big beaster law schools like Columbia or Harvard or whatever. So I set my cap to go to Harvard Law School. And I did. I would take 20 hours a quarter, and I graduated in 10 quarters, which was from Ohio State, which was just at, that was at the end of 48, in June of 48. I got admitted to Harvard Law School. I had a full tuition. I did well in school. I had Phi Beta Kappa, and so I was going well. And with full tuition, I had to have my room and board at Harvard Law School. Well, we were able to keep up with it for the first year, but then I just had a 69. If I had a 70, I could have kept my scholarship, but I didn't have it. And so the last 2 years, I think I ended up owing Harvard $2,300, which in 1951 was quite a bit of money. I was driving used cars for quite a while then to pay off that debt. Well, also, the Korean War started in June of 1950, and I was just getting ready to go to my last year at Harvard Law School. Well, immediately I had a physical exam notice, and I passed it, and then I had a draft notice. Well, what do you do when you get a draft notice? Well, you take your mother down to the draft board. Well, fortunately, they had a policy of giving you a stay of induction to the end of the academic year if you were going to be back in school before the date of induction. Well, I qualified on that, so I managed to get through the end of the year. But I thought they would insist I go in the infantry. Well, they liberalized that because the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines were complaining they were getting all these college boys on stays of induction. So I got another draft notice, and I'll tell you, that really impresses you, getting a draft notice from the President of the United States greeting. Just one greeting. So I was able, though, to enlist in the Navy. So I went to San Diego and...
Okay. Now, when you were in college back at Ohio State, did they have ROTC there?
Oh yes, I had to take 2 years of ROTC.
Okay.
That didn't give me that good impression of the Army either, to tell the truth.
Okay. Well, what did you actually do in the ROTC training there?
Well, we were, as I recall, we were taking classes, we were reading manuals and knowing things about that. In the summer of '45, while the war was still going on, we were doing a lot of marching. It seems to me we didn't do so much marching from then. But I thought the quality of teaching and the quality of grading wasn't up to this, as good as Ohio State University, and it did pull down my point average, which kind of irritated me because the girls didn't have something like that pulling down their point average. But I don't think it matters for me getting into Harvard Law School or getting a scholarship.
Right.
As a matter of fact, that was the first year they had the law school admission test, and at that time they said, well, we won't pay any attention to it except if you're on the edge. The school said, okay, well, we'll look at that and maybe look at and decide we'll admit you. I learned some good stuff in the ROTC, but I wasn't that impressed with it.
Right. Okay. But now you've chosen the Navy, and then where and when do you report now for training and?
Well, I enlisted in Canton, Ohio, and they sent me over to Pittsburgh, and a bunch of us, they put us on planes and flew us out to San Diego, to the Naval Training Center there. And that's where I spent, 16 weeks in boot training.
Okay.
Now, I thought, oh gee, wow, the Navy's kind of mediocre, but really, they had this thing set up. They were training us as enlisted men to do what we would be doing. And they were thinking we'd be on a destroyer. All their training at that time was set up. This is what you would do if you were on a destroyer and you were dealing with 5-inch 38 caliber guns. So I got that. I also had a deal that I could go to a service school and learn one of the ratings. And mine was, I picked, for some reason, personnel man. Personnel man was a yeoman who worked for personnel records.
Right.
In those days I thought, personnel things, that's pretty good. Working in personnel. I changed my mind later. But I did get my rating, but then I was sent to Newport, Rhode Island to Naval OCS. Well, it was called Naval School Officer Candidate. Now, during World War II, they had a midshipman school. But this was a whole new thing in the Korean War. And I was in the 6th class that graduated from that. Well, they did give us an ensign's commission, and it was a regular commission. And we were eligible to succeed to command. We could go all the way up to be Chief of Naval Operations. This is a regular line commission. And we had a star on our cuff. And over the years, I've been kind of proud of going through that.
All right. So basically, this is a regular commission as opposed to a reserve officer commission, basically?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I was in the regular Navy, as a matter of fact, but enlisted. And
when you originally enlisted, was there an expectation that you would train as an officer?
I didn't know.
Okay.
I didn't know.
So the boot camp really was just the standard enlisted man's boot camp.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's and I did the personnelman school. So I on board the destroyer, I would be typing up personnel records. One of the things I did learn from it, though, was how to type, and that was useful. That's been useful ever since. And I can still type on Microsoft Word or whatever it is.
Okay, yeah.
It's useful.
And when you were did they in the boot camp, was there a lot of spit and polish stuff and emphasis on discipline?
Well, there, to an extent. As a matter of fact, the officer in charge of at San Diego at that time, kind of was he was known as a Martinet, but okay, to an extent we'd get it. We would get inspections, and we'd have to have our shoes shined and stuff like that. I managed to get through that okay, but the thing was, I was right out of Harvard Law School, and I really got good grades on the exams. I did the best in our whole outfit. You know, we had a kind of a whole outfit of many companies, and I got elected honor man of company 705. I saw on somebody's obituary recently that they put that down, that they had been honor man. Well, that had some significance, but the reason I got it was just because I think I'd done so well in the test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And was it hard to adjust to life in the Navy, or was?
Oh yeah. Well, being in boot training was like being in a concentration camp. To walk any place away from the barracks, you had to get a walking ship. Yes. Oh yeah. The adjustment was hard, but there I was. I had signed up for it.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, you just kind of went with it and did what they told you?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, yes. I was smart enough to know that I didn't have any alternative.
Now, were you one of the old guys there, or were there a lot of other college?
Yeah, I guess I was. Well, there were a couple of guys from Pittsburgh who maybe were 20 years old, but I was 23.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. A lot of these guys were 17 years old, and I got to observe how they adjusted to the Navy. Because when they got out at 21, they would be younger than I was at 23. Yeah, it was an interesting experience being in boot camp. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then the officer training then at Newport. What did you actually do in that training?
Well, we had mostly academic subjects. We did a little bit of marching. We did a lot of marching in boot training, but we had paved roads, and the Marine Corps recruit depot was just a little way away from us, and we'd see the dust coming up from those guys marching. They were marching on dusty roads. Yeah, we did a lot of marching, but well, and in OCS we did some marching. I was never a big guy for marching, to tell the truth, but we were taking courses, navigation, operations, things that we needed to do as a junior officer on a destroyer, as an officer of the deck, or if we were assigned below, we were an engineering officer, what we would do. And that's what we had, those courses. So we could become a good officer of the deck. Well, one of the things I always had against McCain was he was at Annapolis and I was paying his education, and he was trying to be the last guy in his class so the president would give him his diploma. Now he's wasting my money. I was trying to be the best I could. Well, I thought I better know this stuff if I'm out there someplace and I'm officer of the deck and I have to make a quick decision as to what to do to navigate the ship. Now this was not too long after the Missouri went aground, and I think there was an ensign on that, and he didn't follow the rule as the boys, red, right, returning. If you're going into port, you keep the red buoys to the right. Well, he didn't pay attention to that, and he ran the ship aground, and the Navy was terribly embarrassed about all that. Well, in those days we were getting books like Mr. Roberts and the Cane Mutiny, and they really didn't make junior officers. Well, they in a way made junior officers look good, not bad. They didn't encourage us to be very spit and polished though, as junior officers. And I I wasn't. I probably should have been. You know, I was kind of dumb not to be more spit and polish, but I wasn't. I did what I had to do. You know, I know the smart salute and all of that, and keeping my uniform nice and those things I did. But one of the things I would get in trouble for was I wouldn't, when I went on a new post, I wouldn't go and introduce myself to the officer in command. That's something I got, I think, from Mr. Roberts or the KMU. I don't know. Well, that was kind of dumb, and they didn't like that when I didn't do that. But, you know, generally I was trying to be a good officer, like I was going to make a career of it. I really was. I did make statements like, well, I don't care what's in my fitness report. You know, I was going to, how long? I was going to be there for 3 years, and that'd be the end of it, which was pretty stupid. But, you know, when I got my commission, I was just 24 years old. And I was supposed to be able, with that commission, to guide people who had been in the Navy almost their whole life, quartermasters and all these enlisted men who had made a career of it. And really, but I thought I saw better than others that I had a certain position, but I didn't know as much as all these petty officers aboard the ship, and we would work it out together. I think the petty officers respected me. I think I had a good relationship with them.
Okay, all right. So when do you finish training at Newport?
Well, in July, about around July 30th.
What year?
Of 1952.
Okay.
We got our commissions. Now that was an interesting thing. They hadn't figured out. They had to discharge us from the regular Navy, and we could have walked. They told us we could walk. Well, if we walked, you know, like I had 1 year, they draft board number 110 would have picked me up again. You see. So, and the next day we got sworn into the Naval Reserve as ensigns, and went to our next post, which for me, for some reason, was the 8th Naval District. That really surprised a lot of people, because they were turning out these ensigns to go on board destroyers and other things, and larger ships.
Sure. Okay. But you got, so where was the 8th Naval Headquarters?
Well, it was in New Orleans.
Okay.
Yeah, and a lot, they thought, gee, that's great, you're gonna go to New Orleans and you got all the jazz. Well, I didn't like jazz, I just like classical music. And when I got to New Orleans, I found that it was a very badly managed city. And had grown up in the north, well, Canton, Ohio, or Cleveland. They originated the city manager. I was used to well-managed communities, or Boston, where I had been in Harvard Law School. So I was disdainful of them. I probably didn't think, well, okay, just enjoy New Orleans for what it is. But I was judgmental. And I was right. When Katrina came along, it finally caught up with them. They didn't fix that levee, and they got flooded.
Okay, and so that's something you were looking at in 1952.
Yes, right.
And then, you know, 57 years later, then it happened.
Yeah, right,
okay.
right.
Okay. Now, what was your actual job in New Orleans?
Well, they first had me in another job. It was something statistical. Well, as a security officer, one of the things that I had was commander of the headquarters Naval Guard. We had the guard, and I was put in charge of that. And that was my experience being a policeman. It was very useful. All of a sudden I found out, well, this isn't such a good job, having to tell people they have to follow the rules. And ever since I've had a better relation, I think, with policemen on account of that. Well, we would make security inspections in the 8th Naval District, and I would go along with him to Corpus Christi or other places. I remember making an inspection to the Consolidated Western Steel at Orange, Texas. Well, they had their fences and other stuff left from World War II. Well, I was supposed to make a report as to what they should do. Well, I could have said, oh, well, you got to fix up those fences there and all of those things in case the North Koreans come invading Orange, Texas, which is not very likely. Well, we had adopted the Navy, fortunately, commonsensically, had adopted the idea of perimeter security. Having security where you really needed it, where you had your classified information in safes and things like that. So my report covered that. But and sometimes I would go with some of the more senior officers. I remember we went to Corpus Christi and we went over to Kingsville, Texas, which was right on the edge of the King Ranch, which was very interesting. Well, I remember one day, and they have there at Kingsville, they have a place where they were training pilots. Well, one of them landed on the King Ranch, or crashed on the King Ranch. So we got to go on the King Ranch and see that. So we were saying, well, what do you have to have in the way of security at Kingsville, Texas? Well, you had to have perimeter security. You had to protect any registered publications you had, and you had to protect classified matter, and you had to be very careful about it. And it's set too with Hillary Clinton. I was really shocked at some of that, but you know, she'd never been in the military, and
That's okay. The government servers were all out of date and not very useful, so
Yeah.
they were cutting corners.
well, they perhaps I can't imagine treating classified matter in that way, but that's just my thing. I was very, very much schooled in handling classified material, realizing that a lot of it was overclassified.
Yeah.
But whoever had it, it would make him look better if he classified it secret than if he just classified it confidential. But nevertheless, when it was classified secret, you handled it accordingly. So, you know, there's really no excuse for not properly handling it, but that's another subject.
Okay.
Well, I apparently did well at that. Well, after I got out of service, didn't have quite enough promotion points for a lieutenant, so for a senior lieutenant. So I took a correspondence course. Well, I took it in naval security, you would think, and I got a 4.0 on it. I had a perfect score. So apparently I'd learned something about naval security.
So about how long did you do the naval security thing?
About 2 years.
Oh, okay, so that was pretty much your time in New Orleans then.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, in New Orleans, at the Unitarian Church at coffee hour, I met Martha, my wife. That's 65 years ago, and we got married, and so that's one of the great things I got from New Orleans.
All right. Now, did you, doing the security stuff, did you deal with kind of criminal issues or people stealing things?
No,
or anything like that?
and I was irritated that I wasn't put in the legal department. And I knew those lawyers that were in the legal department. Well, I wasn't in there. Well, one of them had me as assistant counsel, but that didn't go over very well with the general court martial. And they did. I was on a general court martial for a month, so I got that kind of experience. But no, I wasn't getting any legal experience while I was there.
Okay.
Well, then. But the deal was, if you had shore duty, you'd get sea duty. So they ordered me to the USS Coral Sea, which was at that time the newest carrier in the fleet and one of the 3 largest. And I was just ordered there. Well, in those days, they didn't have a naval JAG. Uh, it, uh, and court martials, the junior officers handled it as trial and defense counsel. But the senior officers senior captains who would be commanding officer of a carrier like the Coral Sea, said to the Bureau of Naval Personnel, "You're going to order somebody here who is a law school graduate and who's a member of the bar, and he will be legal officer." Well, I didn't realize that was the situation, but when I got there, I was legal officer. Well, I had no experience really navigating a ship, but I was an unrestricted line officer, so I had to stand those watches. So I stood watch as a junior officer of the deck, and that was quite an
Back up a little
experience.
bit here again. Okay, you to go back to New Orleans. Talk a little bit more about just life down there at the time. I mean, it was a segregated society. I mean, did you?
Oh,
notice
yes.
that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, that of course, bothered me a lot. But we didn't have a Civil Rights Act. In those days, I was a political liberal, and the Unitarian Church was integrated in New Orleans. And the Unitarians were working in the South, are working to do what they could to get rid of what they call it Salvalian segregation. But it was quite an experience riding on the bus riding on the bus to go to work. You had this, the bus was segregated. There was there's a thing you'd put in the back of the seat, because we'd go through black neighborhoods and then white neighborhoods. So we'd have a lot of black and then a lot of white. And so we would switch that wooden
Like a partition or a bar or
partition.
something? Yeah.
And I felt bad about putting that in the face of these blacks, saying, well, you have, in effect, I was saying, you have to stay back there. I wasn't, it didn't make me love segregation. And I was there when Brown v. Board of Education was decided. And oh boy, there was a lot of those people that didn't like it very well. People whom I thought should know better, really. I mean, Ulysses S. Grant tried to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment. And it was unfortunate that Hayes' election, where it was the Republicans, they backed off their position. And we had then until Lyndon Johnson put through civil rights for blacks. I mean, you can say stuff about Lyndon Johnson, but that was a tremendous thing he did, and maybe his motives weren't the right ones, but so what?
Okay, now the military was in the process of desegregating when you were in it. I mean, Truman had started that back in '47.
Yes, that's right. Well, in the Navy, they weren't going very fast. The blacks were stewards. They had black stewards, and they had a lot of Filipino stewards. In my OCS class, there were some blacks. There were some black officers, but as I recall, that was few and far between.
And now on the Coral Sea, did they have black seamen, or were the seamen all white?
Yes, they did.
Okay.
We had black seamen in my, matter of fact, in my boot company.
Okay.
They were gradually, but I'm not sure what the Navy was slower than some of the rest of them on that.
Yeah.
Well, I had two captains on the Coral Sea. Now, in those days, those captains immediately became admirals. The second one I got to know quite well, David McDonald. He was, but he was from the South. He was from Winder, Georgia, and he had the usual Southern view of it. He didn't like the black stewards. He had 2 Filipino stewards. Well, but that ended up with some of my experience. We were at Gibraltar around Easter of 1955, and his 2 stewards got charged with beating up on a merchant. When they were coming back to the ship, these merchants were lined up trying to sell them stuff. Well, somebody did beat up on one of them and work him over, a broken bottle, and they were helped there. Well, what were we going to do? Well, I got word back. I was supposed to say ashore and try to do what I could for them. In those days, I was a young guy. Really, I suppose the coded word was spring them loose and get them back to the ship. Well, I hired 2 solicitors, the Isla brothers, there in Gibraltar. Now, as a matter of fact, they did say that the Navy relief thing for enlistment was to pay my expenses there. Now, that was kind of interesting. The enlisted people wanted me to stay there. Anyway, I got the word I was supposed to stay there. It wasn't direct from Captain McDonald. I'm thinking back. I should have said, well, what does Captain McDonald, the CEO, think? Well, I didn't. Well, they did their research very well. And they had something that went back to World War II and still goes on, the Status of Forces Act. Well, under that act, the Gibraltar authorities had no jurisdiction over these stewards. They were to be returned to their unit. The unit would do any kind of discipline that was to take place. Now, this came up in the Iraqi thing when Obama said, well, I can't leave these people here because we can't get a status of forces agreement. Well, that's political. I doubt that that's true.
But you knew what a status of forces agreement was.
But I can see now you need that, because otherwise these U.S. forces will be there, and they'll want to get the justice of the peace or somebody want to get some business. They'll start accusing him of crimes and things like that. That went back to World War II in England. Well, so we did get him loose, brought him back to the ship, and I was a hero. And that started a good relationship with Captain McDonald. Well, prior to that, he had me and the repair officer for lunch. When he came aboard, he was having some of the department heads for lunch. And he was talking to me. He said, Ryman, he said, I wanted to be a lawyer, but there wasn't that money in the family. But in those days, they called a lawyer a colonel, and he was respected in the community. He says, today, I don't know, the lawyers, they're not as good as, when you applied to be a lawyer, you had to be dishonest. I said, Captain, if I can't make an honest living as a lawyer, I'll do something else. Well, I think that cemented our relationship when I said that. I had other things with him. I'm just trying to think. Well, I was, I had the legal office there, and he was the convening authority, and he was the one who was in charge of discipline. But that work I did, he had captain's mass. That was the, and these guys, in the States, they'd all go. A lot of them would go AWOL. And these dumb guys, they'd go AWOL, and what they wanted to get was a bad conduct discharge, a kick. They weren't thinking about how that would affect them getting jobs or stuff later. But overseas, they were getting always drunk and disorderly charges. So I was working with him on that. And of course, I was standing these deck watches on the bridge too. Well, I remember one night, one of my classmates, and class 6 and I were there, and he was officer of the deck and I was junior officer of the deck, and there was the doctors and dentists, they would immediately get a commission as lieutenant junior grade. We had to sweat through OCS. We might get, and we might end up not getting any commission at all. And we'd be ensigns. Well, and we'd have to stay on as ensign for a year, and then we'd probably be lieutenant junior grade. Well, those guys would come up on the bridge because that was interesting, watching the, being there and going up and down the Mediterranean. Well, one night, the officer of the deck, my friend, I'm not going to mention his name, he said, "Well, let's have a mail boy." And he said to the dentist, he said that they're going to drop a mail boy in the Mediterranean, and we need somebody, we need a lookout on the end of the flight deck to see when it's landed. Well, of course, mail boys are like, there wasn't any such thing.
Snipe
like
hunting, yeah.
Sky hooks and other things. I wasn't entirely sure. I was kind of naive young guy. And so I helped the officer of deck, and we fitted him up with a .45 pistol, and he went out to the end of the flight deck to look for it. Well, the lookouts and other people on the bridge knew all about it, and they were kind of buzzing about it. The captain was in his at-sea cabin, and he heard the buzzing. So he got up and out on the ridge, and somebody pointed out to the dentist on the end of the flight deck. Well, he wasn't a profane man, but he said, "Well, I'll be a goddamn son of a bitch. Well, I'll be a goddamn son of a bitch. Get that guy back up here before he kills himself," which we did. Well, that was quite an incident. And, of course, he could have put both of us in hack, but of course I was a legal officer, maybe that helped me. But that was quite an incident. But Captain McDonald was a very skilled officer. We would refuel destroyers that came up against a ship, and they get the fuel from it. Well, that was kind of a tricky thing. You had the hose, and you could separate that hose if you didn't navigate well. Well, it always went well with Captain McDonald on the bridge. Well, one of my friends, who was a supply officer, talked to him about it. He said, when I was in Annapolis, I got the sword for navigation. He was very good at navigating ship about that thing. Well, that was interesting. Well, he showed it one morning. I was there with the same. It just happened. I was junior officer of the deck with the same guy the other time, and the admiral changed the screen. Well, the screen determined your location, but you had to give orders to the helm and that so that you would be in the right position. Well, Lieutenant Junior, the guy that was officer of the deck, got into problems. He was trying to use something we had at a maneuvering board to figure it out, and the captain came on the bridge, and it was just chaos. Our ships bowed to stern, and they were all over the place. Destroyers, aircraft carrier. We usually had another aircraft carrier with us. Well, McDonald said, "Throw away that maneuvering board. Tell me where you want to go, and I'll get you there."
Mm-hmm.
And so the Lieutenant Junior grade gave him what the position we had, and it seemed to me like in about a minute he had everybody on station. I was really impressed. Well, see, we had a maneuvering board thing that we learned in OCS, and we'd figure it out on that. Well, that would take a little time, particularly for us inexperienced guys. But I was very impressed with that. And he was a great guy. When I came to Clark Equipment Company, I'd had 2 years of practice with Smith and Schnocky in Dayton, plus the time I had on the Coral Sea. Well, I wanted to get admitted in Michigan on motion. I had to have 3 years though. So I had to count the time on the Coral Sea. Well, I wrote to then Admiral McDonald, and I wrote down, I said, well, Admiral, I have this letter here. I've written it describing what I did on the Coral Sea. And really, with law practice, I was the only lawyer on there. And I was doing it for better or for worse, including the guys who would come up for with their own personal problems, and that was part of my job. So I sent it to him, and he signed the letter. He said, well, that's accurate enough. I signed it and sent it to the Board of Law Examiners, and they didn't accept it. I had to take the Michigan bar exam. I was 8 years out of law school on account of that. Well, I passed, but he did that for me.
Yeah.
He was just a super person. Some of the retread officers from World War II, they weren't that great, but he was. In all respects, he was very good. He didn't put on a lot of airs, that I am the 4-striper captain and yours is lieutenant junior grade.
Yeah.
So I kept touch with him for quite a while after that, and eventually he became chief of naval operations, the top guy in the Navy.
Right. Okay. Now I want to wind your story back a ways because you started getting into things on the Coral Sea. And one of the things we didn't talk about was how you actually got from New Orleans to the ship, because you told me it took about 3 months.
Well, of course. Well, we drove. I had some leave, so we visited with my mother in Canton. My father had just died a couple of years earlier. Then we went to Culver, Indiana. Well, she was from Culver, and we were there for a while. Then I took the train to Norfolk. Well, the Coral Sea was in the Mediterranean, so they had to give me arrange for some way. Well, they put me on the Shiwakin, which was it was a gasoline. It was a tanker.
It was an oiler.
Gasoline, and they had aviation gasoline on it. So I got on that. Well, I worked up a good relationship with the captain on there. Well, he was a nice guy. He had been I think a teacher, and he'd gotten recalled. He was a lieutenant commander, and it turned out I was the oldest of the junior officers aboard. He liked to play Scrabble, and I did too. And we played Scrabble at night. Well, he had a guy, John Schilling Canavan, an Irishman from Boston. And he had these guys, when we got into Norfolk, they just leave, you see. Well, unfortunately, Canavan came back, so he had to try him for AWOL. So he asked me if I would help him do that. Well, of course, I'd been in New Orleans, and I'd known General Court Martial, so I did that. I served as president of the Court Martial and took care of all of that for him, for which he really did appreciate that, and I didn't have anything to do, so that was a great thing to do. So we crossed the Atlantic. I remember Hurricane Carol was coming up the East Coast at that time, and the communications officer was worrying we were going to get caught in that. Fortunately, we did. Well, I remember one night we were crossing the Atlantic at I suppose we were going about 20 knots or something, at 22 miles an hour. And this ship came up over the horizon. It was an ocean liner. It was the Independence. And here it was. We watched it go by, and we thought of all those people on that ship having drinks and all that stuff. And we were on this gray vessel. And of course, from Josephus Daniel in World War I, there were no liquor on naval vessels. So there it went. Speeding past us, they were probably doing about 20 knots or 25 knots, 30 knots. 30 knots is probably about the top. The Coral Sea could do 30, 31, and it's 35 miles an hour. Well, for a 1,000-foot vessel in the Mediterranean, that was quite a lot.
Yeah.
So I ended up at Cairns and switched over to the Coral Sea.
Okay. And now just describe the Coral Sea a little bit for people not really familiar with aircraft carriers, in terms of just size or what it's like to live on it.
Well, it was a roughly 1,000 feet long. An aircraft carrier, of course, on the top of it is a flight deck, and underneath it is a hangar deck, where you have the planes. When usually when you're not operating, you might have some of them on the hangar deck that you've tied down, and all kinds of. Well, I remember the legal office was on the port side, up under the flight deck. So that was okay, but it was, we had to go up and down some ladders to get where we wanted to go, and to get to the bridge. Of course, you see on the starboard side was the island with the bridge at the top. The navigating bridge was at the top. Underneath it was the Admiral's Bridge. We carried an admiral aboard. His name was Cruz, Admiral Cruz. He was Commander Cavalier Carrier Division 6, and he had his bridge below us. But we were up there on the top navigating it, and we're arranging for Dennis to go down and look out for the for mail boys, and so. And that was about 13 flights to get up there. Well, I remember a sad story. There was one officer there. He was a lieutenant, but he was what you called a Mustang. He had enlisted, and he got promoted, and he became an officer. Well, he was rushing up those stairs one day after I left, and he had a heart attack and died. Yeah, to be in good physical shape to do that. And I guess it's still true. I don't think they have elevators up to those things. They did have an elevator for the pilots for one flight up into the ready room, as I recall. So yeah, well, okay. And we would be there on the bridge, and the flight deck was filled with these planes, and these guys in different colored uniforms were plane pushers, and we'd be watching them take off and landing. Very interesting. Well, at nighttime, they'd get those things on the bridge, and they'd be running up the jet engines. Those things are screaming. Well, out of that, I got 20% hearing loss, which Navy is, which I'm being paid for finally now by the VA. It was, it was really good to be an unrestricted line officer. These days, the legal officers and the JAG, well, they're below decks all the time. They're like kind of like the dentists. They want to get up above decks on the flight deck, on the bridge, and watch what's going on. And I suppose when they go in, they're lieutenant junior grade. They're staff officers. Well, perhaps that's the best way to run it, but I got the chance to be a line officer and actually be in a position where I was helping in the navigation of the ship. If I had been there long enough, you see, I would have qualified as an officer of deck. And here you have these guys, 25 years old, in charge of this 1,000 feet long ship going up and down the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
The Navy set it up that way, and it worked then. I'm remembering they were having some trouble with collisions out in the Pacific, and I never could understand that. But it could. Well, they said the officers of the deck those days that weren't properly trained. Well, we just had 16 weeks of OCS to learn ours.
Well, you were talking about that incident with your captain coming in and correcting everything that was kind of a mess.
Yeah, right.
And
yeah.
so if that goes on a little bit longer, maybe somebody hit somebody.
Well, yeah, right. McDonald, that could have been bad. Well, everybody had turned off their engines, and they were just they weren't moving.
Okay.
But still, it was kind of tricky. Well, those submarines, destroyer commanders, and usually they may be a lieutenant commander or commander. They prided themselves on their ability to control those ships, and so did everybody down to the ensigns on the bridge. So that was fortunate. But some other Annapolis graduate who hadn't got the sword might have gotten into trouble on that situation.
Okay. All right. Now, during the year when you're with the Coral Sea, was the whole time spent in the Mediterranean, or did you come back to the States at some point?
No, we came back to the States. We came back in December. And Martha had rented a house in Oceanside. And so I was on kind of 9 to 5 because they took the Coral Sea into the naval shipyard in Portsmouth.
Right.
And they had it in there, and they were working on it. So I drive to work every day in my 1947 Studebaker Commander. Oh God, that was a nice car. And so we were there until in March, and our first daughter was born February 2nd, which was about 2 days after the government declared the Korean War over. Based on an armistice which still holds today.
Right.
No, I was stateside, and then we left in March of '55, but I was slated to get out in July, and I did. And I asked to go back by ship. Well, the captain thought, he was a pilot himself. I think he thought little less of me than I wasn't flying. Well, I left Martha and the baby in the U.S., and there was a Constellation flight from Norfolk to Port Loudoun was lost. This one chief petty officer lost his whole family on that. So I just figured the odds. I didn't want to try flying on the Constellation across the Atlantic. So they put me on a ship. It was the Everglades. That was a destroyer tender. Well, most people don't know what that is. Well, they had all kinds of stuff aboard there. They come up along the side of the destroyer, and they'd fix up their motors. And I knew one guy was on the destroyer tender. All he did was work on binoculars, things like that. Well, I was on that, and we traveled on that. That was interesting in one respect. We got down by Cape Cod. Now, this was in July of '55, and got fog all around us. It blotted out the radar. It was the early radar days. One of the things as junior officer of the deck is watch that radar and see who was close to us so we wouldn't run into them. It's important. Well, it blocked out. It just got all white. So they stopped the ship, and I put on the foghorn there. That's the best they could do. Well, does that interest you? Well, about a year later, there was a passenger vessel called the Andrea Doria going through the same place, and I thought, he's going to make it into New York. regardless. Well, unfortunately, Stockholm was there too, and that's how that. I think that's how that crash happened.
All right.
Kind of interesting.
Now, when you were in the Mediterranean, what ports did you stop at?
Well, that was the nice thing about it. Oh well, Barcelona, Valencia, Lisbon, Athens. Uh, uh, God.
Well, you went to Gibraltar.
Well, that's real good duty in that respect.
Yeah.
I had good duty with the Navy, they have to say. Well, Beirut, Lebanon. Beirut at that time was kind of the Paris of the Mideast. Nice place. And something else they appointed in each port a Foreign Claims Commission. That was an officer who had the authority to pay up to $250 in damage to somebody that sailors that damaged their property. I remember these guys would get drunk and they'd break up a taximeter, and I remember in one case these guys were skylarking around, and one guy threw the other guy's sailor cap up on an awning. Well, the guy climbed up on it to get it and broke the awning down. So we paid for a new awning, that sort of thing. Well, everybody envied me of that duty because I could get a hotel room, you see, like in Lisbon or other places. And well, yeah, I would have to hang around the Shore Patrol headquarters, but I did that, yeah. I did that several times in various ports. And I kind of got to like Lisbon. Well, there were just wonderful restaurants there, and you could get the local cuisine. Well, I remember this guy. I think he had been in my class. He was, I don't know, he was a bosun. He did the bosun's mate thing, but I'd be standing watches with him. He'd say, "Geez, I don't want you here. I can't get a hamburger and I can't get a hamburger and a malted milk." Well, I thought, my God, you're going to spend your rest of your life in Pittsburgh. You have a chance to go into all of these restaurants. Well, I guess he missed out on that. I didn't.
Okay. Now, this tape is about us.
I suppose sooner or later I'll have to give in to the thing.
All right. Okay, so let's see. We were kind of closing out sort of your stories about service time on the Coral Sea. We have been talking some about, I guess the last thing we were talking about was how one of your fellow officers wasn't interested in actually trying to look at the cuisine and so forth. So they didn't quite get that. Now you were talking a little bit about Beirut, and Beirut was an area that in certain periods in the 50s had a lot of political trouble. I think 58 or so. But when you were there, 55, things were quiet.
Well, yeah, of course, we didn't get into local politics, but not too much. But I do remember an incident at Beirut. We came in there November 11th, 1954. Well, the Corals, they didn't have a slip or place where we could, they didn't have a port we could get into with our big ship, so we had to anchor out. But the destroyers came in and right into the slips. Well, one of the destroyers, the guys got off and they went immediately to the various houses of ill repute. Well, we already had a foreign claim when I got on shore. What the story was, there was a sailor, it was a sailor in one of them, and they set the shore patrol. The houses of ill repute were off limits. Well, the shore patrol guy was knocking on the front door, so this sailor went running out the back door. But one of the pimps was standing there, and he stepped on his leg and broke it. Well, so there was a claim for the broken leg. I went out to the hospital to visit this man who had the broken leg. Well, he was a Palestinian. I didn't know much about Palestinians and Israel and everything, but he claimed to be displaced by the Israelis. No, I don't know. I don't want to get into that kind of politics. Well, there was this woman sitting there in a beautiful, nice red satin dress. Well, she was the madam. So we had this thing, what are we going to do for this guy who's got the broken leg? Well, they were going to check, they're afraid he had rickets. And maybe could have operated and fused the leg, but it turned out he had rickets. And so they sent him off someplace. And of course, U.S. paid for it. Well, to have the bone knit, but he had a stiff leg, and it didn't end up very nicely. And by that time, I was long gone. But that was one of my foreign claims. There at Beirut. Well, I remember Lieutenant Junior Grade Drabkin, he was a Harvard Law graduate, but he had gotten a supply commission, and he was limited in what he could do. He had the wardroom. He had that officer's mess in those days. But he got hold of the driver at the embassy, and we drive around in his truck. He had he had a Chevy Suburban, as a matter of fact. And we'd go around to these places where they had belly dancing in Beirut. Now, and that was quite a skilled thing, belly dancing. That's kind of interesting. I was, I majored in history and the last thing. I was trying to get as much of the local culture as I could. And so it was very, I think he majored in history too, before I went to law school. But that was an interesting thing in Beirut. And it was all peaceful then. If there was some kind of problem or some kind of bad thing in the government of Lebanon at that time, we didn't know about it.
Yeah, it was a major crisis in '58, but that was well after you were gone.
Yeah, right, yeah, see, that's 4 years later.
Okay. All right. Now, when you think about the time that you spent on board the carrier, are there other particular incidents that stand out in your memory that you haven't talked about yet?
Well, and let me think. Oh, I remember. Well, the engineering officer on the Coral Sea, Commander Carlson, was a senior shore patrol officer in the Mediterranean, a very interesting guy. And I worked with him all the time as legal officer on the biggest or one of the biggest ships. I remember him quite well. Well, I remember one afternoon at Genoa, and I was talking to him, and he said, I was over here at the Italian lines. I was looking at some of their ships. He said they had a real interesting one, the Andrea Doria. So that was kind of interesting. Well, I remember at Athens, he and I went over to, to the port of Athens, and I'm trying to remember the name.
Piraeus.
What?
The Piraeus?
Yeah, Piraeus. And we had breakfast. Well, that wasn't so good in the long run. I got the Greek thing from that. But that was it. He bought my lunch, and I was Foreign Claims Commission in Athens. I don't recall that we had any there. I don't know, the pimps maybe got out of the way or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, at Athens, I'm trying to think. We were anchored pretty close in to Piraeus, so it wasn't quite the same situation as in Lebanon. Yeah, well,
Okay. Well, you'll think of things after we're done, because that's
Yeah,
how it works.
I
Okay.
will. I
All
will.
right. So basically, so what you had done, you'd gone originally to join the Coral Sea, you'd come back to the States, stayed there, then you'd gone back with them again, and then you sailed back the second time. And that was, you hit your fog off Cape Cod and on the
Yeah,
way
well,
home.
and that was
Yeah.
on the Everglades.
Yeah, and that was sort of on the way home. So then you returned back to Norfolk at that point, and do you get
Yeah.
discharged from there, or?
Yeah, well, yeah, they spent, no, I spent a couple of weeks doing physical exams to be sure I didn't have any service-related disability.
Right.
And then, yeah, then they released me to inactive duty.
Okay. Now, and then once you're out, then what did you do?
Well, I had to get back to Culver, Indiana, where Martha was with our baby, and went to the railroad and went to the Greyhound. That was quite interesting. Greyhound had these buses that ran overnight, and they ran from Norfolk to Chicago, and they ran right through Culver, Indiana.
Okay.
Now that the trains, even in those days, you had to change several times from Norfolk. The problem was getting to the train running east and west. Yeah, well, you know, when they have the Broadway Limited, but that went through South Bend. You get the Pensy trains, but to get to those was kind of involved, as I recall. Well, so I just bought a bus ticket and rode to Plymouth, Indiana, and got off there, took off my uniform, and that was the end of my service.
All right.
I never put it on again.
And then, how long before you got a job?
Well, it didn't take me too long. I had written to Harvard Law School about it. Well, I was talking about being they had a thing where they had recent graduates who advised the new students about things. And I thought, well, maybe I'd like to do that. Well, I had worked for Professor McGuire, and he'd give me a good recommendation. I'd worked with him. I wrote part of his case book, as a matter of fact, and he put in for me, but I didn't get that job. And they supplied people, and I hooked up with Smith and Shinaki in Dayton. And that took just about a month, and then we moved to Dayton.
Okay.
Stayed there for 2 years, and then we came here.
All right. And then how did you wind up leaving Dayton and coming up here? I mean, were you just looking for something better, or what happened?
Well, it wasn't working out in Dayton for various reasons, and so they said, well, you probably ought to go someplace else. So one of the things I noticed, our big client was Meade Corporation, and if Meade Corporation had a problem, the president would go to the senior partner and tell him what the problem was, and then he'd come to me, and he didn't like to be cross-examined. So I wouldn't be quite sure of it. I didn't think that, maybe the traffic manager had a problem, a legal problem. So I'd go up through the president of the company, the CEO, come through the senior partner, back down to me. I thought it'd make more sense if there was a lawyer working in Meade who could talk to the traffic manager. So I wrote to all kinds of Fortune 500 corporations and other people, and I said I was available and I'd like to be a lawyer on their legal staff. One of them was Clark Equipment Company. Well, I knew Clark. I'd worked in the factory in World War II, and all these Clark forklifts were there. And it was at Buchanan, Michigan. Well, gee, I thought, Buchanan, Michigan. Gee, I didn't realize that. The truck said Battle Creek, but actually, this is where Clark, for all practical purposes, started. And until about 1990, it was the nerve center of Clark.
Mm-hmm.
Now what? So I wrote here, and Fred Bechtel, who was the general counsel, wrote and said he'd like to meet me. So I came and met him in Niles, and he drove me over to Buchanan. That's one of those funny things. I just got in this town, and it seemed to have magic.
Mm-hmm.
And going up the front street here was kind of like the Garden District in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
So I got the Buchanan disease and stayed here
Mm-hmm.
the rest of my legal career.
All right.
But,
Okay. And now to think back to the time that you spent in the Navy, what do you think you took out of that, or how did that affect you?
well, I think I learned leadership. Although as a legal lawyer in Clark, I wasn't really leading. But on the other hand, as one of the general counsel said, that legal and the business decision are inextricably commingled. So I was able to understand what the businessman was trying to achieve. But one of the things, I was very careful not to get involved in a business decision.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't want to, because you won't be objective about it. It's like the old saying, a man who serves as his own lawyer has a fool for a client. So I did that. I had a great time. I had a lot of fun. I at one time said if there had been amusement tax, it would have taken up my whole pension. Yeah, I had a great time being a lawyer. Well, here we had a Fortune 500 corporation, and later up to 154 in the Fortune 500 list at one time. Clark Equipment Company was. But I could walk to work.
Mm-hmm.
And those days, I didn't have much more. I had a 51 Chevrolet, as I remember, but I didn't have to tie up the car, and I could walk to work. All the time I was here as a lawyer. Well, we got a guy out of General Motors who didn't like it. He wanted to be on the 10th floor or something, and he could only be on the 3rd floor in Buchanan because the zoning code doesn't allow you to have higher than 3 floors. So he took us to South Bend, and actually what happened then was the takeover guys noticed us.
Mm-hmm.
They'd look at us, but they'd say, oh, well, they're in Buchanan, Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
this little town. We come there to try to take them over. The people come at us with pitchforks,
Mm-hmm.
and we would have. But so the company got taken over, but that's after I had retired. I had reached retirement age. So, yeah, of course, a very interesting company.
All right. Okay. Well, you've got a pretty good story, and certainly an unusual one. So I'd just like to thank you very much for sharing it today.
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to do it.